the Sidekick Sage, and it's time for the worst of the best. If you're not familiar with the worst of the best, it's where I take one of my favorite shows, one I'm willing to watch and rewatch every episode, and discussing the worsts of it. Each worst of the best will contain 5 big categories. Analysis idiosyncrasies. These are the worsts that demonstrate certain specific aspects of the show. Nitpicks and non-issues. These are the worsts that generally do not ruin enjoyment of an episode. The eerie feeling of something missing. These worsts ignore aspects of the show in noticeable ways, but generally are still fine in a vacuum. Execution is everything. These worsts are aspects of the show that can be done well, but more often than not are done poorly. And finally, the true worst. These are the big 3 worsts that can really dampen one's enjoyment of an episode. Caveats going into a worst of the best. If your favorite episode is on this list, it's okay. In this list, my favorite episodes isn't there, but many episodes in my top 10 are. Just because an episode is on a worst of the best list does not mean I dislike the episode. It may have rare good execution, it may be the worst in a minor category, or it may be that even the true worst in a series are great. If every category has a different episode for it, that is a good thing. Spread of flaws means there aren't too many dump episodes. In this list, every category does have a different episode, and I love most of them outside of the true worst. Analysis idiosyncrasies. One of the best things about Goof Troop is the contrast between the 2 families, in particular in regards to how the fathers act towards their sons, and the consequences to their relationship and the sons' characters. Today's analysis idiosyncrasies will be focused on that. In particular, the worst episode to show that Pete is a bad father, and the worst episode to show that Goofy is a good father. We'll start with the worst episode to show that Pete is a bad father, Puppy Love. Puppy Love stands out as the only episode that focuses on PJ where Pete isn't shown to be intimidating, emotionally negligent, or outright abusive to his son. Instead, while he does contribute to some of the episode's conflict, he shows a more similar situation to Goofy's, although Goofy ironically doesn't appear, giving him well-meaning advice and aid, despite these backfiring. Pete does have some more moral questionability in his actions, such as stealing Peg's earrings or teaching PJ how to be rude, but he still comes off as, at worst, a typical bumbling dad in this episode. Now on to the worst episode to show that Goofy is a good father, Take Me Out of the Ballgame. Take Me Out of the Ballgame features both Goofy and Pete as overbearing sports dads, where they both put their sons through lots of pain in order to make them good at baseball. While Goofy is often clueless about Max's interests, and it isn't unusual for him to be oblivious, he is far more controlling and puts Max in a worse situation than he often does. He is not deliberately cruel to Max, which still makes him come off as better than Pete in this episode, but the pain he causes in ignorance is noticeably higher than usual. Nitpicks and non-issues. The episode that makes the least sense in universe is And Baby Makes 3, which is one of my favorite episodes for its amazing karmic payoff. But the plot hinges on all the characters mistakenly believing that Peg is pregnant and almost due, including her husband and her son, whose sister is at least 5 years younger than he is. What makes this worse is that these two only believe it because they heard it from the stupidest character in the cast and the least experienced character in the cast respectively, the former of whom isn't even part of the same family. Not to mention the ending where Pete seems to think fat 11-year-olds with full sets of teeth can pass for newborn babies. Again, one of my favorite episodes, if I don't think too hard about the logic. For this category, it was a very close match between 2 episodes, so I'll start with the honorable mention, Dr. Horatio's Magic Orchestra, an episode that either isn't canon or makes it so that the entire series takes place inside a sapient horn's head. If this is not the episode that makes the least sense out of universe, what could possibly beat that? Come fly with me. Here's a summary of the episode. Pete ends up under a light when a computer is plugged in incorrectly, and then ends up sucked into a fly-swatting video game, turning into a fly and escaping the computer. He then finds out that a bunch of flies are attempting to invade his house military style. At the end, he's better, but has human-sized mob boss flies after him. No, none of this is explained in any way. It's a fine episode with a few inconsistencies here and there, but the premise is very out there. Now it's time for a pop quiz. What is the episode as Goof would have it about? I can tell you, but only because I memorized what episode went with that title. As Goof would have it is about Pete attempting to defraud a diet company by pretending that Goofy is him after losing 180 pounds using fake before and after pictures. What does that have to do with the title? I wouldn't know, which is why this is the episode with the worst title in the series, or most of the reason, but there's more. Not only does it rely on the overused crutch of using goof as an idiom placeholder, if you recognize the idiom it's mirroring, as luck would have it, it could easily be mistaken to be for a different episode entirely, Rally Round the Goof, which is about luck. Queasy Rider isn't the only episode in this series that suffers from off-model issues, but they seem the most pronounced in this one. The colors seem more desaturated than usual, which occasionally causes characters to appear almost the same color as the background. PJ and Max's faces look strangely shaped on several occasions, and plenty of main character animation is far jerkier than it normally is. This is a shame because the Roadhogs are interestingly designed characters and deserve a better-looking episode. And the last of this section is Educating Goofy, which you might remember as a heartwarming episode where Goofy and Max learn to put each other's needs first, culminating in a series of deliberately throwing turns in a spelling bee. However, there is a big problem with this episode in scope, not so much in importance, hence why it's only in Section 2, and that's its place in overarching continuity. Goof Troop is not a show that has lots of continuity between episodes, but the problems with this episode are glaring because they contradict the show's backstory as presented in the pilot, as do some others to be fair, and the plot of the second movie/series finale, by having Goofy, who otherwise has been shown to be in high school at least, not have graduated grade school, which, in a more minor nitpick, is also a junior high in most other episodes. Not to mention Bob and Carlos, Max's friends, who never appear before or again, yet are treated as though they've always been part of the squad, and minor characterization errors like PJ ignoring Max in favor of Goofy in one scene, and Pete and Pistol having an exchange that would make more sense for Pete and PJ in another. It is a sweet episode overall, but there are a ton of formalistic oddities. The eerie feeling of something missing. In this section, we will talk about the most egregious ignoring of an established fact for a plot, use of negative continuity between episodes, missing character, and recycled plot. Date with Destiny is the first of the four, and it bears repeating that just because an episode is on this list doesn't mean it's bad. Date with Destiny is one of my favorite episodes of the show for the Goofy and Max relationship, and I would definitely be happy to see more of Miss Pennypacker and Gilda. However, none of that changes the fact this episode can only work because Pete being a bad father is conveniently ignored. If Max gets monitored based on circumstantial evidence that is no worse than anything shown in Acts by Addition, where Pete being a bad father was a huge plot point, and then taken away despite his protests, there is no reason at all why PJ should be left with Pete. Conveniently, Pete and PJ are both in the episode, but never once interact with each other or with Miss Pennypacker. As a result, the plot can continue unimpeded. The second in this section goes to Pete's day at the races. The reason is because the previous two episodes both affect this one. Frank and Goof, 2 episodes prior, ends with Pete in another country while the family goes home with the doppelganger monster. He's then fine in the next episode, E=MC Goof, until the end, where he ends up forgotten in space headed towards the sun. Pete's Day at the Races, as the title implies, is an episode where Pete is the main protagonist. No indication is given about how he escaped either of his previous fates. Many episodes in the series have a missing character, or 2, or 3. Notably Lethal Goofin in all of the episodes without the kids. But the worst of the bunch would have to be Nightmare on Goof Street. Nightmare on Goof Street falls squarely under the category of kid-free episodes, but the main plot is that Pete's house is taken apart and stolen by Spud and Wally, so PJ and Pistol are mentioned multiple times, notably when their rooms are located, and Peg is supposed to have taken the kids on the trip during the episode, but when she gets home and sees what has become of the house, they still don't even appear once, not even as a voiceless cameo. This last one was tough, but I eventually decided to give this one to Catch a Goof, given how late it is in the story and how little new it offers. Pete's plot is the third diet episode in the series after Gymnasium, and as Goof would have it, Goofy's is very similar in concept to Maximum Protection and execution to Close Encounters of the Weird Mime. Even some of the episode details, like Pete bribing the children to help him and criminal doppelgangers, are in other episodes like Goodbye Mr. Goofy and Mrs. Spoonerville for the former, and Counterfeit Goof for the latter. That said, there are still creative jokes in the episode, and it's still fun to watch overall. Execution is everything. Now we're on to the Execution is Everything segment, wherein I need to stress again that an episode being present in this section is not evidence that I don't like it. In fact, 2 of these episodes are among my favorites in this series, the least funny episode and the most mean-spirited episode. The least funny episode of Goof Troop is none other than From Here to Eternity, which only has a few jokes. maybe a total of 90 seconds of humorous content. But the episode isn't funny not because it's boring, but because it's realistic and sad. For an episode that spends much of the time in the air, it paints a surprisingly down-to-earth picture of emotional abuse, even compared to other PJ episodes, and makes sure that Pete doesn't get away with it. As a result, I think this episode was very well written and definitely worth a watch. As for the most mean-spirited episode, this may depend quite a bit on taste, but I personally think that Bringin' on the Rain was handled very well. Pete was very cruel to both Goofy and PJ, even compared to how he usually is, and the stakes were higher than ever, with Goofy getting arrested, and PJ doing hard labor without nearly enough fluid intake. But in the end, Pete gets exactly what's coming to him by having to take up Goofy's old cell. And the best part is that what happens to him after that is left unclear. I personally loved this episode, but I could see it being too mean-spirited for someone else to enjoy. And in turn, the worst use of the show's premise is personally one of my least favorites, but it tends to be fairly popular overall. That episode being Leader of the Pack. It's a fine episode of a kids show, but the concept of Goof Troop overall is to be a character-driven sitcom, and in this episode only 3 of the main characters show up, 2 of them are mostly irrelevant near the end, and the episode primarily focuses on Max and 3, or 5 if you count Duke's added muscle, one-shot characters. This could have been mitigated if Debbie showed up in any later episodes, but sadly, she did not. The true worst. And now it's time for the portion of the episode that the most caustic of critics can enjoy, the true worst. The most boring episode of Goof Troop overall is The Ungoofables. Maybe it's just because I haven't seen the source movie, but despite watching this episode several times, it never really sticks with me. It's one of the Ancestors episodes, which have very little to do with the characterization of the main characters outside of the framing device, which was incidentally the best part of this episode. Unlike the others, which parody concepts that are easily accessible to kids, this one parodies a movie that would not likely have been seen by the target audience when the show was new, based on historical events of little interest to children younger than teenagers. The episode that has the worst overall characterization and my personal least favorite subplot in this series is Inspector Goofy. Pete vouches for making Goofy city inspector in order to get his competitor shut down, and it backfires on him. How can they mess up a plot like this? By making Goofy a hypocrite who tells Pete he will treat all of the people he inspects equally, and then going easy on everybody except for Pete and the mayor, and by involving a subplot where Peg is happy about Pete being kicked out of the house and taunts him with food. And to top it all off, PJ suggests selling Pistol to get Pete back in the house, which isn't even important to the plot in addition to being out of character. The only character in this episode who isn't unlikable is Pistol, who does very little, and technically Max, but he never speaks. And the worst story of all is Goofs of a Feather. It's an episode starring Pete, the most common episode star due to his status as the primary manipulative antagonist of the series, as well as karmically the most common sufferer of comedic punishments. In this episode, neither manipulation nor much slapstick are a focus. Instead, Pete wants to go duck hunting. To make up for the low stakes, the rest of Pete's family acts like the stakes are very high. Pistol and PJ in particular are extremely melodramatic about how evil Pete is in this episode for wanting to kill the ducks. And then they act like hypocrites by first insisting Pete take care of the supposedly dead Drake's grieving family, and then getting mad because there are ducks in the house. I love this show to bits, but even I don't blame anyone for getting a bad first impression by watching this one. And that was the worst of the best for Goof Troop. Do you think of any of these episodes are better at their job than I do? Any I missed, do you feel fit better? Go ahead and leave a comment, and thank you for watching.
Beep beep boodity boppity bada boop boodity bop boop bada boop bop boop bop.